In the last section, we refactored our app to order the list of days from the current day onwards. So let's wrap up by doing some additional styling inside of our day item component. Now what we really want to do is make the current day to be really large, nice, and bold, and then fade off for the remaining days. To do so, we're going to dynamically need to change the styling we have in here, right? The first day needs to have a very large font size, whereas the last day needs to have a much smaller font size. To make sure that we've style each day appropriately, we're going to be using that days until property that we passed in. So days until, again, is going to start off as 0 for the current day and then count onwards all the way to the number of days until, which will eventually be 6 for the last day. So to make our dynamic styles, we're no longer going to be using the stylesheet.create function in here. Instead, we're going to dynamically generate all of our styles inside of our React component. Let's see what that ultimately looks like. I'm going to delete our stylesheet.create, and then we don't really need the var stylesheet at the top either anymore, so I'll delete that as well. Next, we'll add another helper function in here, and we'll just call it style. And now rather than calling styles.day, we'll just call this .style. Cool. So in the same way that stylesheet.create would return an object, we're going to do the exact same thing with this style function here. So return an object like so. And in here, we're going to add 4 different properties, each of which is going to give the impression of a really big, nice and bold first day, and then eventually taper off to the last day that we have listed. Each of these properties will have a value that's dynamically generated based on the value of this.props.daysuntil. So let's first add in the property names, and then we'll write the code for each of them. Ultimately, we're going to have color, font weight, font size, and line height. Cool. So we're not going to put any code directly in for the values of each of these. Instead, we're going to make a number of helper methods in here as well. So the color property is going to be assigned from this.color. Let's go ahead and create that helper function now. And from here, we're going to ultimately need to return a color. Now, the purpose of this color function is not actually to change the color so much as it is to return a different opacity. So we'll say var opacity is 1 divided by this.props.daysuntil. Now the opacity is basically how see-through is the text. So with a value of 1, we end up with a very solid looking piece of text, right? All the text that we already have on here has an opacity of 1. As opacity gets closer to 0, so as it decreases, the text starts to get a little bit see-through over time. So over time, we're going to see a really big, nice and bold piece of text, and it's going to gradually fade out over time. And by the time it gets to Friday, it will be almost invisible. So to assign our opacity, we actually have to insert it into a RGBA string. So we'll say return RGBA 0, 0, 0. And then we'll close that and we'll insert opacity like so. So the end result here is something that looks like RGBA 0, 0, 0, and then over time it's going to start at 1, but then it's going to go down to say like 0.4, or excuse me, 0.5, 0.4, 0.3, fade out over time. The first 3 arguments in here are the RGBA, red, green, blue values. So given that they're all 0, they're all going to start out as solid black and stay that way even as the value of days until changes. So the next property we'll do is font weight. We'll say this dot font weight. Don't forget to add a semicolon on each of these, by the way. and we'll do our font weight. Now the font weight is essentially how bold the element is. So we want to start off with a really bold looking piece of text. So to do so, we'll say font or var weight equals, we'll do 7 minus this.props.days until. And then we'll say return weight times 100. So what's happening here is our font weight always has to be a multiple of 100. So 100, 200, 300, 400. As the number gets higher, it becomes more bold. So we want our first day, when this.props.days until is very small, to be very bold, in the high hundreds. But over time, as this.props.days until increases, it's going to go closer towards 100 or 0, right? So over time, as time goes on, that value is going to become closer to 0, but always in multiples of 100. Next, we'll do this.font size. And for our font size, we're going to do something pretty simple here. We'll start with a size of 60, and then as each day goes by, we're going to just decrease it by 6 units. Lastly, we'll do our line height, this.line height. And our line height will also just decrease over time. It will start as 70 minus 4 for every day that passes. Okay. By the way, line height is somewhat related to the font size. The font size is how big the text is. The line height you can kind of read as how much margin is there on top and below of the font itself. So the first entry, Saturday, will have, kind of be isolated, have a lot of spacing on top and bottom, but as time goes by, Friday will be, relatively close to Thursday. So let's go ahead and save this, and then we will refresh our simulator. It looks like we have a syntax error somewhere on line 31. I missed a comma right here. And cool, so this is looking pretty good. Our first day starts out super bold, super large, but as time goes on and this.props.days until starts to increase, we see eventually we get a nearly invisible, because the opacity gets small, very small sized, because the font size is small, and very skinny text, because the font weight gets small as well. So this covers on how to create dynamic styles that change as our properties change. Just so it's entirely clear, I feel like the one part that I might have brushed over here, the reason that this.props.days until is changing is that for every day item that we're creating here, we're passing in a different value for days until. So we have 7 day items, one for each day of the week. And you can imagine that days until starts as 0 and then goes to 1 and then 2 and 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So as we go down the list, our days until increases, and that's what generates our different styles. Awesome. So this looks like a fantastic app, a little bit more interesting, but also more complex than your standard Hello World for a first app. Now that we've kind of gotten some of the basics on how to put an app together, or at least some of the code semantics, let's go into the next section where we're going to talk in great detail about the architecture around React Native.